Adana Kincaid stretched in her chair and looked at her watch. There were still 4 hours left until the end of her shift. Clayton's emergency dispatch center was open 24 hours a day, but the night hours stretched especially slowly. The green lights on the panel blinked evenly, and the phones were silent. The rare calls concerned domestic fights or false calls from drunks. She opened the thermos of coffee and took a sip. The bitter taste reminded her that she was out of sugar at home, and Raymond had once again forgotten to buy groceries. He'd been forgetting a lot of things lately. Forgetting to take out the trash, forgetting to pay the bills, forgetting that he'd promised to fix the kitchen faucet. Adana glanced at the photograph on the table. A snapshot from 3 years ago, taken at her cousin's wedding. Back then, Raymond had still smiled when she'd put her arm around his shoulders. Those moments didn't happen now. He came home from work tired, ate dinner in silence, and spent his evenings in front of the TV or on the phone. A phone call interrupted his musings. A woman's voice, excited, reported a suspicious noise in the neighboring apartment. Adana wrote down the address, relayed the information to the duty squad, and returned to her thoughts. 33 years, 5 years of marriage, and what next? Same job, same conversations, same silent dinners. When her shift ended, the sun had already risen above the horizon. Adana packed her bag and headed for the exit. Waiting for her in the parking lot was the old Honda that Raymond had promised to repair last spring. The air conditioning wasn't working, so she had to drive with the windows open. Instead of driving home, she turned toward the mall. There, a small casino operated in the basement. Adana had never been much of a gambler, but today something was pulling her to try it. Maybe she just wanted to delay returning to the empty apartment, where Raymond was either still asleep or had already left for work without even leaving a note. The casino greeted her with the coolness of the air conditioning and the soft clinking of slot machines. Several older men sat at tables, mechanically pressing buttons. Adana walked over to the nearest available machine and dropped $20 into it, an amount she could spend without remorse. The first 10 minutes passed without much emotion. She won little by little, lost, won again. Then the lights flashed on the screen, a melody played, and the numbers on the display began to grow. At first, Adana didn't realize what was happening. It wasn't until the receptionist ran up to her with a wide smile that she realized the magnitude of what was happening. $475,000. "Congratulations," exclaimed the receptionist, extending his hand for a handshake. "It's a jackpot. It'll take some paperwork and tax deductions, but it's still an impressive sum." Adana nodded, but the words passed her by. There was only one thought running through her mind. This money would change everything. She would no longer have to put up with Raymond, his perpetual discontent, his habit of criticizing her every decision. She could rent an apartment, start a new life. It took more than an hour to process the paperwork. The administrator explained about bank transfers, about the deadlines for depositing funds into the account, about the need to notify the tax office. When all the documents were signed and the money was transferred to her account, Adana felt strangely dizzy. Not from joy, more from the suddenness of the change. On her way home, she stopped at the supermarket and bought groceries she usually thought were too expensive. Good coffee, imported cheese, fresh fish. Maybe she should cook something special and tell Raymond about her winnings over a romantic dinner. Maybe the money would help them repair their relationship. The apartment met with the usual mess. Raymond had left dirty dishes in the sink. Tools he'd brought home from work and forgotten to put away were lying on the table. Adana put the bags in the kitchen and began cooking. The fish was sizzling in the pan when the key turned in the lock. Raymond walked in, dropped his bag by the door, and walked to the bathroom without saying hello. Adana heard the sound of water, then he appeared in the kitchen, rubbing his face with a towel. "Hi," she said, trying to put a cheerful note in her voice. "Hi," he replied, opening the refrigerator. "What's that smell?" "I'm cooking fish. I bought a good one. It was on sale at the supermarket." Raymond snorted. A discount on expensive food still leaves it expensive. How much did you spend? Adana felt the joyful mood begin to evaporate. $120, but I have good news. $120? He slammed the refrigerator door shut and looked at her with an expression she knew all too well. We'd agreed to save money on food, car loan, rent, utilities. Raymond, listen, I won at the casino today. He froze, still holding the beer can. At the casino? You gambled with our money? $20, and I won $475,000. The silence lengthened. Raymond slowly opened the can and took a sip, never taking his eyes off his wife. Adana watched the emotions shift in his eyes. Disbelief, surprise, something else she couldn't define. $475,000, she repeated. Can you imagine? We could pay off our debts, buy a decent car, maybe even a down payment on a house. Raymond put the jar on the table and sat down across from her. Show me the paperwork, he said in the tone he usually used to talk to not-so-smart clients at work. Adana pulled a file folder from her bag and placed it in front of Raymond. He flipped through the pages methodically, studying each line. His face remained unruffled, but Adana could see the muscles in his jaw tensing. "The taxes deducted?" he asked without raising his eyes. "Yes, that leaves $328,000 net. And that money will go into your account." "Our joint account," Adana corrected. "We're family." Raymond closed the file and leaned back in his chair. His expression changed, hardening. "Family," he repeated. "Interesting. When you decided to go to the casino, did you consult me?" "It was spontaneous. $20, Raymond, the amount you spend on beer in a week. It's not about the amount. It's about you making decisions without me. And now that you're lucky, you're talking about family." Adana turned off the stove and turned to face him. The fish in the skillet sizzled, filling the kitchen with a pungent odor. "What do you mean by that?" "I'm saying this money should be invested wisely, not spent on nonsense like you've already started doing." "What nonsense?" Adana's voice was getting louder. "I bought proper food. First time in 6 months. $120 for dinner is not a normal meal. That's wasteful." Raymond got up and started pacing around the kitchen. Adana knew the habit. When he was angry or thinking about something important, he couldn't sit still. "Listen to me carefully," he said, stopping in front of her. "Tomorrow morning, we're going to the bank. We'll deposit the money under my supervision. I'll decide what we spend it on." "Under your control?" Adana couldn't believe her ears. "It's my winnings." "Our winnings? You just said so yourself. We're family, remember? But why should you be the one to dispose of it?" Raymond grinned, but there was nothing kind about it. "Because you don't know how to handle money. $120 for dinner is a good indication of that. If I gave you complete freedom, there'd be nothing left of your winnings in 6 months." Adana felt anger boiling up inside her. All these years, Raymond had treated her like an unreasonable child, criticized her work, her friends, her decisions. But now, he was overstepping his bounds. "It's my money," she said firmly. "I won it, and I'll decide how I spend it." "Yours?" Raymond laughed. "You live in the apartment I rent. You drive a car I bought. I pay half the utility bills. And now you're talking about your money? I work. I pay for groceries, for my clothes, for gas. You're working as a dispatcher for pennies. Without me, you couldn't even rent a dorm room." Raymond's words cut painfully into her ego. Adana realized that he was right about a lot of things. Her salary was indeed small, but that money changed everything. Now she could be independent. "You know what?" she said slowly. "Maybe I really should get a dorm room and live apart from you." Raymond's face darkened. "Just try it. I'll file for divorce before you know it, and I'll demand half of all jointly acquired assets." "What jointly acquired assets? You said it all belongs to you." "The winnings were made during the marriage, so it's considered joint property. My brother Zephyr is a lawyer. He confirmed it for me. You've already spoken to Zephyr?" Adana couldn't believe it. When? This afternoon. I called him, told him the situation. He said I could claim half of it in court, and considering that the apartment is registered to me and I earn more, the court could award me more than half. Adana looked at her husband and didn't recognize him. In a matter of hours, he had gone from an indifferent but generally harmless man to someone greedy and calculating. Or perhaps he'd always been like that, just never had the occasion to show it before. "So, you've already made up your mind," she said quietly, without even listening to me. "I've made a reasonable decision. Tomorrow we'll go to the bank and make a deposit in my name. We'll spend the money gradually on the really important things: a new car, down payment on a house, investments. And if I refuse, then I file for divorce. I get my share through the court. Plus you're homeless because I rent the apartment. Plus you pay court costs because Zephyr is expensive, but he's good at what he does." Raymond spoke calmly, like he was discussing weekend plans. But Adana could hear the iron confidence in his voice. He was ready to follow through on his threat. "You want to take away my only chance to change my life," she said. "I want that money to do us good, not spent on stupid things." "What stupid things? I haven't even had time to buy anything." $120 for dinner is stupid. Tomorrow, buying expensive clothes is another stupid thing to do. The day after tomorrow, you want to go on vacation is another stupidity. Women can't plan for the long term. That phrase was the last straw. Adana took a step toward Raymond, her hands clenched into fists. "Women can't plan? Really? Which one of us forgets to pay the bills? Who promises to fix a faucet and forgets about it for 6 months? Who spends money on beer and soccer bets?" "I earn that money, so I have the right to spend it," Raymond replied. "And you earn pennies and now you're pretending to be a financial genius. Oh yeah? Then earn your own money and don't claim mine. For the last time, we're going to the bank tomorrow. If you refuse, you'll have the divorce papers by tonight." Adana looked at him and felt something inside her break. Not her heart, not her soul, something more fundamental. The notion that this man had once cared for her, that there had been love between them, or at least mutual respect. "You know what?" she said slowly. "File for divorce. I'm sick of living with a greedy coward." Raymond twitched the corner of his mouth. "A coward? I'm the coward? I work 12 hours a day to provide for this family, and you sit in a warm place at night and get paid to answer the phone. At least I'm not stealing my wife's winnings. I'm not stealing, I'm cleaning up. Somebody's got to be the adult in this family." Adana stepped closer. Raymond was standing by the coffee table, holding onto the edge of it out of habit. "An adult? You want to steal my money and you're threatening to sue me. Is that mature? I'm not stealing. I'm taking responsibility for our financial future." "Ours?" Adana's voice broke into a scream. "We have no future. You killed it with your greed." She shoved him in the chest. Not hard, more out of desperation than anger. But Raymond hadn't expected the move. He tried to keep his balance, but his back hit the coffee table. The heavy glass tabletop swayed, and he lost his footing. The fall was ridiculously slow. Raymond swung his arms, trying to grab onto something, but only hit a vase on the table. The back of his head hit the sharp corner of the glass tabletop. The sound was soft, almost imperceptible, like someone dropping an egg on the tile floor. Raymond collapsed onto the carpet and didn't move. Adana stood over him, breathing heavily, and didn't immediately realize what had happened. A dark stain was slowly spreading beneath his head. Adana stood motionless, staring at her husband's unnaturally twisted body. The seconds dragged on like hours. The only thought in her head was that this couldn't have happened. A simple quarrel, a slight jolt, and now Raymond was lying on the floor with a broken head. She knelt down and touched his wrist, looking for a pulse. Nothing. The skin was warm, but there was no movement of blood beneath her fingers. Adana tried to feel for a pulse on his neck. Same result. Panic came over her in a wave. We should call an ambulance. Maybe there was still something that could be done. She grabbed her phone and was about to dial when she stopped. What would she say? That she'd pushed her husband during an argument and he'd accidentally smashed his head in? Adana pictured herself at the police station answering the detectives' questions. Why were they fighting? Over money. Why did she push him? Because he wanted to take her winnings. How's this gonna play? Greedy wife kills husband for money. She put the phone down and tried to think rationally. Raymond fell and hit his head on the table. An accident. These things happen. We just need to clean up the evidence of the altercation and come up with a plausible version of events. Adana looked around. The pan of fish was still sizzling in the kitchen. She turned off the stove and removed the pan from the fire. Then she returned to the living room and scrutinized the furnishings. The coffee table was crooked. The tabletop had been moved. Shards of a vase were lying on the floor. It all needed to be tidied up so it looked natural. She carefully adjusted the table, being careful not to move her husband's body. Picked up the vase shards and tossed them in the trash. Then she thought about how to explain the broken head. Could Raymond have tripped? Or felt sick and passed out? Adana tried to imagine such a scene. Her husband comes home from work. They are having dinner. He gets up from the table to get something, loses his balance, and falls. But why did he get up? What did he want to take? Adana looked at the coffee table. There were the usual TV remotes, a few magazines, a phone charger. Nothing worth getting up for during dinner. She went to the kitchen and put 2 plates of fish on the table, added the vegetable salad she'd made earlier, poured water into the glasses, made it look like they were having a peaceful dinner. Then she went back into the living room and took another look at the scene. The blood on the carpet looked frightening, but there was nothing to be done about it. But now the picture looked plausible. The man had eaten dinner, got up to turn on the TV, but had tripped or felt ill. Adana picked up the phone and dialed the emergency number. The operator's voice was professionally calm. "Emergency services, I'm listening to you." "I need an ambulance," Adana said, trying to keep her voice shaky with excitement. "My husband fell and hit his head hard. He's not answering. Give me your address." Adana dictated the address and answered the standard questions. How old was her husband? Did he have a pulse? Was he conscious? The operator asked her not to move the body and to stay on the line until the crew arrived. 10 minutes later, the doorbell rang. Adana opened to 2 uniformed paramedics and silently ushered them into the living room. The men examined Raymond, checked his pulse, looked under his eyelids. "How long has he been like this?" the senior paramedic asked. "I don't know exactly," Adana replied. "I was in the kitchen making dinner. I heard the sound of a fall, came running and saw him on the floor." "Did he complain of feeling ill? Headaches? Dizziness?" "No, he seemed fine. Came home from work as usual." The paramedics looked at each other. The older man pulled out a radio and said something softly into it. Adana couldn't make out the words, but she could tell from the tone that the news was bad. "I'm sorry," he said, turning to her. "Your husband is dead. Apparently, he died of head trauma." Adana covered her face with her hands and cried. The tears came easily, almost naturally, a mixture of relief that her version had passed and real grief at the realization of what had happened. "What's next?" she asked through her tears. "We should call the police. In a sudden death, it's mandatory procedure. They will record the circumstances of the accident, and then the body will be transferred to the morgue." The next half an hour was spent waiting. The paramedics didn't touch anything else, just covered the body with a sheet. Adana sat in the kitchen and drank water, trying to calm herself down. She needed to pull herself together before talking to the police. When the police arrived, the paramedics briefly reported the situation and left. 2 officers examined the scene, took Adana's statement, and said they were calling in the special detectives. "Do we have to do this?" Adana asked. "Couldn't you tell it was an accident?" "Standard procedure for sudden death in the home," one of the officers explained. The detectives would come, ask a few questions, and then it would be closed. The detectives showed up an hour later. A 35-year-old woman with short hair and attentive eyes introduced herself as Detective Keisha Morrison. Her partner, a tall man with a scarred chin, identified himself as Sergeant Dantel Okonkwo. Keisha scrutinized the living room, studied the position of the body, and photographed the scene from various angles. Meanwhile, Dantel was interviewing Adana, writing down her statements in a notebook. "Tell me what happened," he asked in a soft voice. Adana repeated her version. Her husband came home from work. They had dinner. He got up to get the TV remote control, but he tripped or felt sick and fell. "What time did he get home?" Dantel clarified. "Around 7 p.m. The usual." "What was his mood?" "The usual. Tired after work, but nothing special." "You didn't have a fight?" "No." Adana shook her head. "They ate dinner peacefully, talking about work." Keisha approached them and gestured for Dantel to step aside. They talked quietly about something. Then the detective turned to Adana. "Ms. Kincaid, we'll talk to the neighbors, see if anyone heard any extraneous noises. That's standard procedure too." "Of course," Adana agreed. "Do whatever you need to do." Keisha and Dantel left the apartment. Adana could hear them knocking on neighboring doors, talking to the tenants. Most of the neighbors were at work, but a few were at home. An elderly Mrs. Palmer from the apartment across the hall said she heard loud voices about 8 o'clock at night. Couldn't make out the words, but it sounded like someone was arguing. "Male and female voices?" Keisha asked. "Yeah, that's right. They were talking normally at first, then they started raising their voices. For like 10 minutes maybe. And then what? Then it stopped. I thought they made up." Dantel took Mrs. Palmer's statement and moved on to the next door. The young man in the apartment below said he heard a falling sound about 9:30. "Like something heavy falling to the floor," he explained. Then a woman's scream. Not long, about 3 seconds. Keisha and Dantel returned to Adana's apartment with the new information. The detective sat across from her at the kitchen table. "Ms. Kincaid, neighbors say they heard loud voices coming from your apartment around 8 o'clock this evening. Are you sure you weren't arguing with your husband?" Adana felt her heart beat faster, but tried to keep a calm expression on her face. "We may have spoken louder than usual," she said. "Raymond has trouble hearing and sometimes you have to raise your voice." "What were you talking about?" "Work, weekend plans, the usual family talk." Keisha nodded, but there was doubt in her eyes. She got up and looked around the living room again, then went back to the kitchen. "We'll take the body to the morgue for an autopsy," she said. "That's standard procedure too. The results will be ready in a few days." Adana nodded, trying to look like a grief-stricken widow. Inside, however, she was clenching with fear. What if the autopsy showed something suspicious? What if the detectives found inconsistencies in her story? 3 days after the funeral, Keisha Morrison sat in her office studying the results of Raymond Kincaid's autopsy. The pathologist had been brief and precise. Death had been caused by a head injury sustained from a fall on the sharp edge of a glass surface. No other injuries were found on the body. At first glance, it looked like an accident, but something about the case was bugging Keisha. She reread the neighbor's statements, then her notes from her conversation with Adana Kincaid. Dantel entered the office with 2 cups of coffee and placed one in front of her partner. "Something wrong with this case?" he asked, noticing her concerned expression. "Mrs. Palmer heard an argument at 8 o'clock last night," Keisha said, pointing to the tapes. "Adana Kincaid claimed that her husband collapsed around 9:30, so there was half an hour between the argument and the fall." "What's so strange about that?" "They argued, then they made up. He got up to grab the remote and fell." "Then why did she lie to us? Said they didn't fight, just had a peaceful dinner." Dantel shrugged. "People don't like to make a big deal out of things, especially when the husband had just died." Keisha finished her coffee and stood up. "Let's go talk to the widow again, and check out her alibi in detail." They arrived at Adana's house around noon. The woman opened the door in a black dress, eyes red with tears. But Keisha noticed that her hands weren't shaking, and she held herself with enough confidence for a grief-stricken widow. "Detective Morrison," Adana said in a low voice. "Come in. Is something wrong?" "We have a few follow-up questions," Keisha explained, sitting down in the living room in the same spot where the body had been lying 3 days ago. "Nothing serious, just getting the details." "Sure, go ahead. Mrs. Kincaid, the neighbors heard loud voices coming from your apartment about half an hour before your husband fell. Are you sure you weren't fighting?" Adana was silent for a moment, as if pondering an answer. "Maybe I didn't phrase it exactly right," she said finally. "We had a little spat. Nothing serious." "What were we arguing about?" "Money. Raymond wanted to buy a new tool for the job, and I thought it was a waste. The usual family disagreements." Keisha wrote the answer down in her notebook, even though she remembered every word. "How much did the tool cost?" "About $500. That's a lot for our budget." "And how did the dispute end?" "We agreed to discuss the purchase later. Then we had dinner, and Raymond got up to get the TV remote." Adana's voice trembled and dropped. Dantel leaned forward. "Mrs. Kincaid, your neighbors heard not only loud voices, but also the sound of breaking glass. Can you explain that?" Adana blinked, clearly not expecting such a question. "Broken glass?" she interjected. "I don't remember that. Perhaps it was in another apartment." "The neighbors say the sound came from your apartment," Dantel insisted. "About the same time as your fight." "Yeah," Adana hesitated. "Perhaps Raymond accidentally touched the vase when we were arguing." "Yes, that's right." He flailed his arms and knocked the vase off the table. Keisha and Dantel looked at each other. There were no shards in the apartment during the initial inspection. "Where is that vase now?" Keisha asked. "I cleaned up the shards right after it happened. Threw it in the trash." "Show us that bucket." Adana led them into the kitchen. The trash can was empty and obviously recently cleaned. "I took out the garbage yesterday," she explained. "I couldn't bear to look at the debris anymore." Keisha nodded, but there was disbelief in her eyes. She asked Adana to show her exactly where the vase had been, how Raymond had hit it, which way the shards had fallen. The woman answered, but she sounded uncertain, as if she were making up details as she went along. The doorbell rang. Adana went to open it and returned with a tall man in an expensive suit. He looked to be in his 40s, with short graying hair and attentive eyes. "Zephyr Bambara," he introduced himself, extending his hand to Keisha. "Lawyer, brother of the deceased." "Detective Morrison," Keisha replied. "My condolences." "Thank you." Zephyr looked around the living room. "I trust the investigation is moving forward?" "Adana told me about the accident, but I'd like to hear the official version." "We're still gathering information," Keisha replied cautiously. "Did you have much contact with your brother?" "Quite often. Raymond called me several times a week. We discussed work, family matters." "Did he talk about the problems in the marriage?" Zephyr cast a quick glance at Adana, then looked at the detective again. "Like any family, there were disagreements, but nothing serious." "Had he called you recently?" "Yes, the day he died. In the afternoon. He told me." Zephyr was silent, as if considering whether to continue. "What did he say?" Keisha persisted. Adana had won a large sum of money at the casino. Raymond was concerned about how the money would affect their relationship. Adana turned sharply to her brother-in-law. "What amount of money?" Dantel immediately asked. $475,000, Zephyr answered, keeping his eyes on Adana. "After taxes, about $328,000. Keisha felt the adrenaline rush in her blood. A large winnings the widow hadn't mentioned in a word. That changed the picture dramatically. "Mrs. Kincaid," she said in an even voice, "why didn't you tell us about the winnings?" "I didn't think it was important," Adana replied. "Raymond died of an accident. What did the money have to do with it? Was your husband upset about the winnings?" "Not upset, concerned. He wanted us to use the money wisely." Zephyr stepped forward. "Detective, Raymond told me that they were going to fight over that money. He wanted to take control of the sum, and Adana was against it." "Is that true?" Keisha asked. Adana hesitated. "We discussed different options," she finally said. "Raymond suggested one plan, and I suggested another." "Did he threaten to divorce you if you didn't agree to his terms?" "How do you know that?" "Answer the question." "We talked about divorce as a possibility, but not seriously." Zephyr shook his head. "Adana, Raymond asked me to prepare the divorce papers. He was going to file them the day after his death." There was a heavy silence. Adana looked at her brother-in-law with an expression of hatred. "Zephyr, why are you saying this?" she whispered. "Your brother is dead. Isn't there not enough grief?" "I want to know the truth about his death," the lawyer replied firmly. "Raymond was afraid that you might do something rash because of the money." Keisha stood up. "Mrs. Kincaid will need to talk to you at the station. In more detail." "Am I under arrest?" "Not yet, but I recommend you get a lawyer." Adana looked at Zephyr. "Will you be defending me?" "I have a conflict of interest," he replied coldly. "I was representing Raymond's interests." The next day, Keisha and Dantel arrived at the mall casino. The clerk who processed Adana's winnings was a thin, middle-aged man with a nervous demeanor. He was constantly adjusting his glasses and avoiding direct stares. "Yeah, I remember that woman," he said when the detective showed Adana's picture. "Won the jackpot on a machine, $475,000. "What time did that happen?" Keisha clarified. "Around 9 in the morning. The exact time is in the computer, 9 hours and 14 minutes. "How did she behave?" The administrator thought for a moment. "Confused at first. She couldn't believe she'd won. Then she became very focused, scrutinized all the documents, asked questions about taxes, when the money was due." "Did she mention her husband?" "No, she was alone. But when she filled out the paperwork, she wrote married under marital status." Dantel asked for the security footage from that day. The receptionist took them to a back room where several monitors displayed footage from various points in the casino. Adana was clearly visible on the screen, sitting at a slot machine. She looked tired and indifferent, mechanically pressing buttons. When the jackpot went off, her face changed. First bewilderment, then a slow realization of what was happening. "Interesting reaction," Keisha remarked. "Not joy, but rather relief." "Like she'd been waiting a long time for this," Dantel agreed. They got copies of the recordings and went to the lab to analyze the fingerprints. The technician examining the coffee table from the Kincaid apartment was ready to share the results. "There are a lot of prints on the glass surface from both spouses," he reported. "But there is an interesting detail. On the edge of the tabletop, where there was a crack from the impact, there were traces of blood and a small patch of skin. Does that support the theory of a fall?" Keisha asked. "Yes, but there's a nuance. The angle of impact suggests that the deceased fell at an angle rather than straight ahead. It's as if he was pushed by something." "Could that be the result of a loss of balance?" "It's possible, but more likely an external force." Keisha and Dantel left the lab with new information. The technical expertise was gradually disproving the accident. Now it was necessary to find witnesses who could tell more about the nature of the relationship between the couple. They went to Raymond's workplace. The elevator maintenance company was located in an industrial area. The workshop was filled with machinery, parts, and tools. The deceased's co-workers were eager to talk about him. "Raymond was a good man," said the foreman. "A man with rough hands and tired eyes. Reliable, punctual. But in recent months, he'd become more withdrawn." "Did he talk about family problems?" Dantel asked. "Sometimes he complained about his wife, said she spent too much money, didn't understand the family budget. Recently he mentioned that she'd won the lottery and was acting strange." "Strange in what way?" "More independent. Stopped asking permission to shop, started making plans without him. Raymond was getting annoyed." Another worker, a young guy with tattoos on his arms, added, "He said his wife wanted to leave him. He was afraid she would take all the money and file for divorce. Was Raymond planning to do something about it? Yeah, he wanted to get ahead of her. Said his brother-in-law would help him get some of the winnings through the courts. Keisha wrote down every word. The picture was becoming clearer. A husband, afraid of losing control of his wife's money, and a wife dreaming of relief from a failed marriage. Meanwhile, Zephyr Bambara was conducting his own investigation. As an experienced lawyer, he knew that the official police did not always find all the evidence. He had his own methods of obtaining information. Zephyr started with bank records. Through acquaintances in the financial field, he found out that Adana had indeed received a large sum of money from the casino. But what turned out to be more interesting was that she had already started planning her spending. On the day of Raymond's death, a few hours before he returned home, Adana called a real estate agency and inquired about renting a one-bedroom apartment. The realtor confirmed that the woman was planning to move in the next few days. She said she wanted to start a new life, the realtor said over the phone. She was very persistent, asking to be shown options the very next day. Zephyr also found the cab driver who drove Adana home from the casino the day Raymond died. The man remembered the passenger because she was unusually agitated. She was on the phone the whole way, the cabbie said. She was telling someone that she was finally free to live her life. Mentioned that she would no longer tolerate control and coercion. Zephyr wrote down all this information and gave it to Detective Morrison. Keisha scrutinized the new information. So, Adana was planning to leave her husband before the fight, she told Dantel. And the call to the realtor was made 3 hours before Raymond died. That seriously changes the picture. She wasn't just defending herself during the conflict, she was planning the breakup in advance. They decided to question Adana again, this time at the station. The woman came with a court-appointed lawyer. The young lawyer looked inexperienced and was as nervous as his client. Keisha began with a direct question. Mrs. Kincaid, why did you call the real estate agency the day your husband died? Adana was confused. I don't remember such a call. We have a recording of the call with the realtor. You were interested in renting a one-bedroom apartment. The lawyer asked for time to consult with his client, but Keisha continued. You also called someone in a cab and talked about freedom from control. Who were you talking to? Probably a friend. I was excited about winning. Give me the name of that friend. Adana didn't say a word. Her lawyer tried to intervene, but it was obvious the woman couldn't explain her actions. Dantel showed her a printout of her bank transactions. There's a call history on your phone. We can get a warrant to seize your phone and check all your conversations for the last week. That won't be necessary, Adana said quickly. I called my sister, telling her about the winnings. What's your sister's name? Phoebe. Phoebe Johnston. Keisha wrote the name down even though she suspected it would be a lie. The pressure on Adana was building, and her story was beginning to crumble under the weight of the evidence. Zephyr Bambara, meanwhile, continued his own investigation. He met with Adana's co-workers at work, trying to find out more about her plans and sentiments. A dispatcher who worked the same shift with her gave some interesting details. Adana had been talking a lot in recent months about how she wanted to change her life. She complained about her husband, calling him a control freak and a cheapskate. Said she wanted to go somewhere far away. Did she mention divorce? Several times, but she'd add right away that she couldn't afford it financially. Zephyr realized he was building a picture of a premeditated crime. Adana wasn't just defending herself during a domestic dispute. She planned to free herself from her husband and use the winnings for a new life. Raymond's death solved all her problems in one fell swoop. Keisha and Dantel entered the interrogation room where Adana and her attorney were already sitting. On the table was a folder of evidence that the detectives had been collecting for the past 2 weeks. The woman looked tired, dark circles under her eyes. Mrs. Kincaid, Keisha began, opening the folder. We checked your statement about calling Phoebe Johnston's sister. A person by that name does not exist in your contacts. The lawyer tried to object, but Adana raised her hand, stopping him. "All right," she said quietly. "I was talking to myself. I do that sometimes when I'm nervous." "Talking to yourself about being free of control?" Dantel interjected. "Yes. Winning changed my life. I felt like I could finally make my own decisions." Keisha put the photos from the scene in front of her. "Forensics showed that your husband fell at an angle characteristic of an external force, not a loss of balance. He may have tripped over the edge of the carpet. There are no folds or bumps in the carpet," Keisha argued. "But your prints on his shirt in the chest area suggest that you pushed him." Adana remained silent, looking at her hands. The lawyer whispered something in her ear, but she didn't respond. Dantel turned on the tape recorder. "We also have statements from your husband's co-workers. Raymond told them that he plans to file for divorce and get part of your winnings through the court." "That's his right," Adana replied. "But you didn't want to accept that. So you planned ahead. You called a realtor, looked for an apartment. I had just as much right to get a divorce as he did." Keisha leaned forward. "But a divorce would have meant property division, and his death left you the sole heir to all the money." "I didn't kill my husband," Adana said, but her voice sounded uncertain. Zephyr Bambra entered the room. Adana's lawyer tried to protest his presence, but the detectives explained that the dead man's brother had a right to participate in the investigation as an interested party. Zephyr sat down across from his sister-in-law and stared at her silently for several seconds. "Adana," he said calmly, "Raymond called me the day he died, told me that you threatened him with divorce and demanded that he not claim your winnings. We were just discussing options. He also said you might do something rash. Literally, she looks like she'd do anything for that money." Adana looked up sharply. "Your brother wanted to steal my money, control my every expenditure like he's been doing for 5 years. So you did have a serious fight," Keisha said. "Yes, we did," Adana shouted. "He threatened to take away my only chance at freedom." "And what did you do?" Adana realized she'd said too much. Her lawyer asked for a recess, but the detectives kept up the pressure. "Mrs. Kincaid," Dantel said, "we understand that you didn't plan the murder. It was spontaneous out of anger, but withholding evidence and perjury only makes your situation worse." "I pushed him," Adana said quietly, "but I didn't want him to die." The room fell into silence. The lawyer covered his face with his hands. "Tell me what happened," Keisha asked in a soft voice. Adana began to speak in a monotone, as if she were telling someone else's story. "Raymond demanded that she sign the money over to him, threatened to divorce me and sue me, said I was stupid and didn't know how to handle money. I realized he was going to take away my last hope of turning my life around." "And that's when you pushed him?" He was standing next to the table, waving his arms, yelling. "I just wanted him to get away from me. I didn't push him hard enough, but he lost his balance." "Then what happened?" "He fell and hit his head. At first I thought he was just stunned, but when I tried to find a pulse..." Adana's voice broke. "I realized he was dead." "Why didn't you call an ambulance right away?" "I was scared. I realized how it would look. A greedy wife killed her husband for money. I tried to fake an accident." Zephyr listened to the confession with a stone face. When Adana finished, he said quietly, "My brother was not a perfect husband, but he didn't deserve to die for wanting to control the family budget." Keisha formally read Adana a charge of involuntary manslaughter and concealing evidence. The woman was arrested and placed on remand. The trial began 3 months later. The prosecutor pushed for a first-degree murder charge, arguing that Adana planned to get rid of her husband for money. The defense argued that it was an unintentional killing as a result of a family conflict. The jury heard testimony from witnesses, examined evidence, and reviewed casino camera footage. Adana's own confession, recorded during the interrogation, made a particularly strong impression. Zephyr Bambra acted as a representative of the interests of the deceased. He told the court about the last days of his brother's life, his fears and concerns. His speech was restrained but emotionally compelling. Raymond was afraid of losing his family for money, he said. He wanted to save the marriage and provide financial stability. His methods may have been wrong, but his intentions were honorable. Adana's lawyer tried to portray her as a victim of domestic control and psychological pressure, but the evidence spoke against that theory. Planning the escape, finding an apartment, lying to investigators, all of it indicated a cold calculation. After a 2-week trial, the jury reached a verdict: guilty of second-degree murder. The judge sentenced Adana to life in prison without parole. Now she sat in a cell in a maximum security prison, staring at the gray walls. The other prisoners sometimes tried to talk to her, but Adana preferred silence. She felt no remorse for Raymond's death. Rather, she regretted that she hadn't done a better job of hiding the evidence. The money from the casino had gone to Raymond's relatives according to the will he had made before he married. Zephyr used part of the inheritance for charity, as his brother had planned. Adana received letters from journalists offering to tell her story for money. She threw those letters away without reading them. The outside world no longer interested her. The prison routine was no worse than the routine of her marriage to Raymond. The same repetitive days, the same unfreedom, the same control. Only now it wasn't her husband's greed that controlled her. It was the state system. Sometimes lying in her prison bed, Adana thought of those few hours between winning and Raymond's death. That brief moment when it seemed life could change. Those hours had cost her the rest of her time.